On August 22nd, 1922, in a large house located at 858 North Andrews Boulevard in Los Angeles, 3 gunshots were fired. When the police arrived, they found a terrified Dolly Oesterreich locked in the closet with her husband, Fred Oesterreich, lying dead on the floor. It had the looks of a robbery gone wrong, but as the investigation unfolded, this case turned out to have more twists than anyone could have expected. Who could have fired a gun in the peaceful neighborhood of North Andrews Boulevard? Could this have been an act of vengeance? Welcome back to Mysterious Hook, where we shed light on under-the-radar cases across the country. Today, we will be looking at the twisted case of Dolly Oesterreich. If you haven't subscribed already, make sure to do so to never miss out on another story. So without further ado, let us walk on the edge of mystery. Walburga Oesterreich, better known as Dolly to her friends and family, was originally Walburga Korschel before her marriage. Though her exact birthday isn't known, we do know that Dolly was born in 1880. Her parents were German immigrants to the United States, but it isn't clear if she was born in Germany or after her parents settled in the USA. Dolly grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Many of her neighbors were also German immigrants, and she was brought up in a German community. Dolly's family wasn't financially stable, so at the age of 12, she began working at a textile mill that was owned by Fred Oesterreich. Though we don't have much information about her life with her family, we do know that she was a charismatic, sweet, and charming girl. She was very outspoken, and it didn't take long for her to make friends. She was quite well liked at the textile mill where she worked, and this was where she caught the attention of Fred Oesterreich. Soon, Fred and Dolly got to know one another, and they began courting soon after. Fred, who was 17 at the time, would often meet Dolly, who was 12. Their young love blossomed, and when Dolly turned 17, the two of them got married. In 1898, both Dolly and Fred found themselves in a rather good position. Fred was managing his family's business, while Dolly helped Fred. They were happily married. When he entered his 20s, Fred became a very successful man as he began to open a number of other businesses, apart from his family's textile mill. One of those successful businesses that he owned was an apron factory. Dolly, who as a child faced financial troubles, now had no problems at all. She was now able to afford a better lifestyle than she was previously living. But though her husband Fred was bringing home good money, this also meant that he had to work long hours. Fred began working late hours to run his multiple businesses while Dolly stayed at home and took care of their household needs. Things had been going well for the couple for some time, but eventually problems started to emerge. Now Dolly, like any person, had needs. She wanted her husband's love and attention, but Fred was a busy man. He couldn't give Dolly what she wanted because he was often working too late, and when he was home, he often spent his time getting drunk and gave no time to Dolly. This left Dolly feeling unhappy and unsatisfied with their marriage. Dolly wanted to fill the void caused by her marriage and began having affairs with a number of men to do so. Fred was too preoccupied with his work and his business to even notice. In 1913, Dolly, who was now a 33-year-old woman, was rumored to have had a number of lovers besides Fred up till this point. Needless to say, Fred, who was usually at one of his factories, was always too drunk or too busy to attend to Dolly. The couple did have a son at one point, but he passed away at a young age, which only compounded the loneliness Dolly was experiencing. On a warm autumn day in 1913, Dolly was alone at home. Her husband, Fred, was at work. She called her husband at the apron factory, complaining that her sewing machine did not work. Otto Sandhuber, who was 17 and the sewing machine repairman at the factory, was sent by her spouse to fix it. Dolly Oesterreich had spotted him at her husband's workplace and knew that he would be the one to come. The doorbell rang, and Dolly, who had now changed into nothing but a robe and stockings, answered it. In came Otto Sandhuber, a naive 17-year-old boy, and he was immediately bewitched by Dolly. They both began their long-winded affair that day, but little did they know the lengths it would go to. After this, Dolly and Otto would initially meet up and go to different hotels together so that no one would notice them. They were cautious because they didn't want Fred to know about their affair. This went on for a couple of months, but Dolly got tired of it. Her main concern was that hotels cost money, Fred's money. She didn't want Fred to realize that his money was going missing and find out that Dolly was going to hotels with someone who was working at his factory. So she suggested that their sexual relationship could be continued at her house. Now Otto would come to the house whenever Dolly wanted. Now that Dolly wasn't going to hotels anymore, and Otto would often come over, she thought the problem was resolved. But there was one thing she didn't take into account. Otto was coming over so often that the neighbors started to notice. One day, a neighbor asked her who this man was, who was coming to her house so often, and to this, she replied that he was her half-brother. She told her neighbor that he was a vagabond, and that was the reason he was coming around all the time. The neighbor believed her, and they got away with it. But then she began to worry about what would happen if Fred found out. She didn't want to go back to going to hotels, because that would mean she had to spend Fred's money. This time, Dolly came up with an even more twisted plan. Otto was to move into Dolly's attic. He would resign from his position at the factory and sever all ties to the outside world. Dolly would provide him with food and water, and whenever Fred was away at work, they could be together. When you think about it, this does seem extreme. However, from Otto's perspective, this meant the world to him. Now Otto had neither family nor friends to ask for permission for such a request. So he obliged. To him, this meant that he didn't have to work anymore. He didn't have to pay for shelter or food. And to top it all off, he would get to be with Dolly. It is also important to mention that Otto wanted to be a pulp fiction writer at the time. With so much free time, he could practice writing his novels, and this was a big reason that he thought that this offer was so good for him. When Otto agreed to her request, Dolly was overjoyed. She got him situated in the attic, which was right above the bedroom she shared with her husband. It was accessible through a panel in the ceiling of the bedroom's closet. She put in a bed and a desk so that he could write his novels. She would also bring him books from the library every week. Along with that, she would never forget to bring him food every day. At night, Otto would read mysteries by candlelight and write stories about love, lust, and adventure. He would work on writing pulp fiction and hope to get his work published someday. By day, he would make love to Dolly and help her around the house. No one knew about the man in the attic. Fred was also unaware of the fact that there was a man in his house, staying right above his bedroom. This bizarre routine went on for 5 long years. Fred Oesterreich was a busy man, but that didn't keep him from noticing odd things that were happening around his house. Fred noticed that while he was away, their food was finishing sooner than it should have been. His cigars would run out, and when Dolly wasn't in the bedroom, he'd sometimes hear noises coming from above. Fred would constantly ask Dolly if she too heard anything peculiar in the house, but she would always insist that there was nothing going on. These strange occurrences made him think that he was going crazy, so Dolly advised him to consult with a doctor. Fred then booked an appointment with the doctor, but to his surprise, the doctor said there was nothing wrong with him. Dolly then justified it, saying that maybe he was too stressed out with work, or it could be because he got drunk too often. In the meantime, Fred had opened a new factory in Los Angeles, and he decided that maybe they should relocate. That way, he could leave the strange and disturbing occurrences behind. In 1917, both Dolly and Fred went to LA to find themselves a new home. But it took them longer than expected because Dolly wanted a house with an attic. However, the problem was that the houses in LA at the time didn't usually have them. Despite that, Fred managed to find a house with an attic on Sunset Boulevard. Dolly was immensely happy with the house because it was in a beautiful location, but most importantly, had an attic. They then went back to Milwaukee and prepared for the move. During this time, Dolly made sure to send Otto to LA before they moved, so that he could get situated in the attic prior to their arrival. Otto agreed, and he moved to LA at Dolly's request. As Fred and Dolly got comfortable in their new house in LA, life continued as it had back in Milwaukee. Otto was doing great. He had managed to publish a few of his stories under another name and earn some money. He was now writing a novel during his time in the attic. With the money that he had gotten, he helped Dolly with some of his expenses at their new home. Meanwhile, Fred started to get paranoid. He claimed that the noises that he had heard in the house in Milwaukee had followed him to LA. Fred soon started working long hours once again and started drinking even more. As the months passed, his relationship with Dolly started to turn sour, and they began to fight a lot. By 1922, Fred and Dolly's fights had become constant. On August 22 of that year, Fred and Dolly had their biggest fight yet, and Otto, who was in the attic at the time, heard it. To him, it sounded like Fred wanted to hurt Dolly, and Otto felt he had to do something to protect her. He crawled down through the small hole that exited into Dolly and Fred's bedroom. He then found two .25 caliber pistols that were on the table and ran towards Fred and Dolly. When Fred saw Otto, he immediately recognized him, since he used to work for Fred at the apron factory. Fred couldn't believe that the noises he had heard from the ceiling were actually because Otto had been living there. In a split second, he realized that his wife had been lying to him and had been having an affair behind his back for 10 long years. Fred and Otto then got into a fight. In the ensuing struggle, Otto ended up shooting Fred 3 times in the chest, and Fred died instantly. This was when both Dolly and Otto started to panic. They then came up with a plan for Otto to lock Dolly in a closet from the outside and take the key and the guns with him to the attic along with all the cash in the house and Fred's expensive diamond watch. They knew the neighbors would report the gunshots, and this way, Dolly would have an alibi and it would look like this had been a robbery gone wrong. When the Los Angeles police showed up at the large house located at 858 North Andrews Boulevard, the scene they found was the man of the house, rich businessman Fred Oesterreich, lying on the floor shot dead. His wife, Dolly Oesterreich, was locked in a closet. When they let her out, she frantically cried and said that a strange man had broken into their home and robbed them. However, on investigating the scene, the police found only the husband's watch and some cash missing, with plenty of other valuable items still in the house. Something about the crime didn't seem quite right, but on the surface, they accepted the story of a burglary gone wrong. Dolly was a suspect in the murder of Fred Oesterreich, but the police couldn't understand one thing. How could she have locked herself in the closet if she was the one who killed him? With no further evidence, they soon dropped the charges against her, and she was in the clear. She even held a funeral for Fred, and soon inherited the millions that belonged to her husband. Dolly was now a rich widow. Not only was she rich in terms of wealth, she was also rich in love. Her lover, Otto Sandhuber, could now live out in the open with her. The two of them soon relocated to a new home which also happened to have an attic, but here was the twist. Since Fred was now gone, Dolly could have Otto live out in the open with her, but instead, he continued to live in her attic. Otto continued writing pulp fiction, and with the money he earned from his published articles, he was allowed to purchase a typewriter, since there was no one there to hear it now. Meanwhile, not long after this, Dolly managed to get herself a new lover. This time, it was her own lawyer, the same lawyer who defended her when she was a suspect in Fred's murder and had helped handle Fred's estate after his death. His name was Herman Shapiro, a successful lawyer and an eligible bachelor. When Dolly saw him, she fell in love with him instantly. She was so smitten by him that she made her first mistake. One day, she decided to give Herman a gift, a diamond watch. But the problem was, this was the same watch as the one that was allegedly stolen the night that Fred was killed. It didn't take long for Herman to notice this, as he was aware of the missing watch as her lawyer. When he saw its striking similarity, he asked Dolly about this. To cover for herself, she told him that she later realized the watch hadn't actually been stolen, as she had found it under a window seat cushion some time after the night her husband died. Herman had his doubts, but he loved Dolly, so he remained silent. Herman, who was a big-time lawyer, went back to working long hours, and this left Dolly unsatisfied. Even with Otto in the attic, she decided to go out and find another lover. The next man she approached was Roy Klum. Now, Roy was an aspiring actor and a businessman, and had a flashy lifestyle which attracted her. He too became very interested in Dolly. Soon after, the two started having a sexual relationship. For Dolly, Roy kept her occupied while Herman was busy with work, and when Roy wasn't available, she would be with Herman. And if neither was around, Otto was always there in the attic, still infatuated with her. As time went by, Roy started to get extremely fond of Dolly, which is why when Dolly asked him to do something suspicious, he did it without question. She persuaded him to ditch a gun for her, saying it resembled the burglar's gun that had killed her husband, and she didn't want to get in trouble. Roy agreed and tossed this gun in the La Brea tar pits. Once the job was done, Dolly felt like she could breathe a little easier without having to look over her shoulder. However, there was still the second gun in her possession. To deal with this, she approached her neighbor and sweet-talked him into burying the other gun in his backyard, telling him the same story she told Roy. Dolly was quite a sweet talker, and he agreed to her request and buried the pistol under a rose bush in his garden. Now that the two crucial pieces of evidence that killed Fred Oesterreich were done with, Dolly finally felt free. But she did not know that the worst was waiting for her. Almost a year went by, and no one knew who had killed Fred Oesterreich on the night of August 22, 1922. However, by July of the next year, a detective received a tip that Herman was wearing a watch that looked exactly like Fred's. This excited the police, and the case of Fred's shooting soon became an active investigation. The detectives wanted to take this piece of information and connect it to the missing pieces of the puzzle. To their surprise, they found out it was none other than Dolly who had given him the watch. In the statement when Fred's body was found, she said that a robber had stolen all of Fred's personal and valuable belongings, which included the diamond watch that was currently on Herman's wrist. This now made Dolly the prime suspect in the murder. This was coincidentally also the time when Dolly decided that she no longer needed Roy Klum, perhaps because she had got what she wanted after using him to dispose of the gun. However, Roy was not happy with this. In fact, he was so upset that he went to the police with the story and told them all about the gun that Dolly gave him and what he did with it. The next day, when the headlines hit the papers, her neighbor also walked into the police station with the second gun. Here, he confessed that she had given him yet another pistol shortly after the murder, asking him to dispose of it because it too closely resembled the gun that killed her husband, and she did not want to get into trouble. The case became a hot topic, and soon the police had recovered the pistols from both locations. However, they were badly decayed. Despite this, the police were able to determine that the two were of the same caliber as the gun which murdered Dolly's husband, Fred Oesterreich, but both were too rusted to determine whether they had fired the fatal bullets. Dolly was subsequently detained by the authorities under suspicion of murder. While Dolly was detained, she realized that Otto was still in the attic, and no one was home. Fearing for Otto's well-being, she confided in Herman and told him that her vagabond stepbrother was living in the attic of her home, and requested him to check on his well-being. Herman was puzzled when he heard this. He went straight to her house, and when he knocked on the trapdoor leading to the attic, a thin, pale man answered. This was when Herman finally met Otto Sandhuber, Dolly's attic lover. When Herman and Otto started talking, he heard the truth. Otto wasn't Dolly's stepbrother. Rather, he was a part of her life before she even settled in her LA home. Herman was completely baffled when he found out the truth that the person who lived in Dolly's attic was actually the person who killed Fred Oesterreich. He was the person whom the police were looking for, and all this time he had been living in Dolly's attic. What shocked him even more was that he learned that Dolly and Otto were romantically and physically involved with each other. This angered Herman, but he was still fixated on Dolly. He could have handed Otto over to the police, but instead he told him to leave the area right away. Otto, on hearing that Dolly was in jail and that he might soon become a suspect, finally left his hideaway without putting up a fight. He moved to Canada, changed his name to Walter Klein, and started living a new life. Dolly, on the other hand, did not serve prison time, as the police could not prove that she was involved in the murder of Fred Oesterreich, so she was released on bail. At this time, Herman moved in with her. The charges against Dolly were eventually dropped since the police couldn't find any evidence proving that she had murdered Fred. Years passed and the mystery of Fred's death remained unsolved, until after 7 years, Herman ended his relationship with Dolly in 1930. In 1930, after breaking up with Dolly, Herman went to the police and spilled everything he knew about Otto, including how Dolly had kept him in the attic for 10 long years. A second warrant was issued for Dolly's arrest. She was charged with conspiracy. Meanwhile, Otto Sandhuber, who was living as Walter Klein, was charged with murder. Otto, who had now started a new life, became the prime suspect. When he was caught, he confessed that he was the one who had killed Fred on the night of August 22, 1922. Otto Sandhuber was interrogated, and this was where he told his story. He told investigators that he had an overpowering love for Dolly, which was the reason he agreed to stay with her in her home's attic for 10 years. On that fateful night, he believed Dolly was going to be killed, and so he shot the husband to protect her. He even took officers to the house and showed them where he hid in the attic. When the story got out to the media, they dubbed this case as the Batman case. This was because Otto had lived a cave-like existence in the attic. Despite Otto's claim during the trial that Dolly had held him captive and practically enslaved him, the jury found him guilty of manslaughter. But the statute of limitations had run out, and Otto, now 43, walked free. Walburga Dolly Oesterreich was a smart woman. She was a sweet talker and had inherited millions of dollars of her husband's money. For her own trial for conspiracy, she hired renowned defense lawyer Jerry Geisler. During her conspiracy trial, Dolly testified that Otto had shot her husband and made it appear like a robbery, and she insisted that she was not involved in killing her husband. When asked about the tampering of evidence, she said that she had only lied to the police to shield Otto. Despite hiding Otto for 10 years in the attic, she also admitted during the trial that she had loved her husband. Jerry Geisler was worth his weight in gold, and he won a hung jury at the trial, and Dolly was free. Finally, in 1936, all charges against Dolly were dropped. She then found her second husband, Ray Burt Hedrick, a year later. They stayed in Los Angeles together for 30 years, until she passed away in 1961 at the age of 80. What do you think about this shocking case surrounding the life of Dolly Oesterreich? Do you think she deserved to stay free after all she did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, like and share it, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.